Chapter 12. Focused but detached. Leif Babin. Western Ramadi, Iraq, 2006. The unmistakable sound of AK-47 fully automatic gunfire echoed with deafening blasts around the small, smoke-filled room as bullets ricocheted off the concrete floor and walls. "We're taking fire through the door," I thought. "It's on." We no longer had the element of surprise, having just blasted in the outer door with an explosive breaching charge that woke up the neighborhood with a thunderous boom. Clouds of dust and smoke choked the air and made it difficult to see as we entered the building, scanning for threats. But once inside the room, we realized it was only a small foyer that led to another locked door, which led to the main house. Shattered glass and debris were strewn across the floor as Charlie platoon SEALs and Iraqi soldiers stacked up in the train, a line of shooters ready to make entry once the locked door was breached. Our intelligence indicated that within this home lived an insurgent who had planned and carried out multiple deadly attacks on U.S. and Iraqi troops. The latest attack was well-planned and well-orchestrated. Insurgents had hit an Iraqi army outpost, which contained a handful of U.S. military advisors, with machine gun fire from multiple directions. Next, they lobbed mortars into the compound with deadly accuracy. While the Iraqi soldiers manning the guard post panicked and took cover, another insurgent drove a truck packed with explosives, a VBIED, vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, into the compound, detonating in a gigantic fireball of death and destruction. Only through the extraordinary bravery of the U.S. Marine and Army military advisors who stood their ground and returned fire was anyone in the compound saved. Tragically, a U.S. Marine and a soldier were killed, along with 6 Iraqi soldiers and several others wounded. The fortified outpost was reduced to a shattered wreck. But the strategic damage to morale of the Iraqi troops proved even greater than the death and destruction inflicted. In the days following the attack, nearly the entire battalion of several hundred Iraqi soldiers deserted. The insurgents had dealt a crushing blow. Now, Task Unit Bruiser had the opportunity to capture or kill one of the ringleaders of that attack. We aimed to accomplish our mission. As we waited to make entry through the next door, the sudden full-auto burst of gunfire instantly got everyone's attention. It was without question an AK-47, the Iraqi insurgents' primary weapon. "They're shooting at us through the door," another SEAL said, in a calm but loud voice. "Stand by to get some." He had quickly come to the same conclusion that I had, that we all had. It was a contingency for which we were well prepared. The terrorist we were after was likely armed, certainly willing and eager to kill us, as was just about everyone associated with him. The SEAL shooters in the front of the train pointed their weapons at the closed and locked door, ready to engage any threat that emerged. The next SEAL back in the train reached down to his gear and pulled out a hand grenade, an M67 fragmentation grenade, or frag grenade, in preparation to neutralize the threat. If the enemy was shooting at us, we needed to be default aggressive to solve that problem. It was the common sense thing to do, rather than enter a room where a hostile enemy waited to gun us down. But as the SEAL operator removed the grenade from his gear pouch and unwound the tape we used to secure the pin, I sensed that something wasn't right. Stepping out of the train, I looked around. There were enough weapons covering the potential threats in the room. I was the assault force commander, the senior leader on the assault team that entered the house to capture our primary target. Or, if he was shooting at us, kill him as justified under the rules of engagement. But the most important place I could point my weapon was not at threats. I had plenty of SEAL shooters whose primary job was to handle such threats. As the leader, I trained my weapon away from the threats and toward the ceiling, what we called high port. The weapon pointed to the sky. With my weapon at high port, I no longer looked down the sights with tunnel vision. Instead, I looked around. I observed everything that was going on. That gave me maximum vision. I could see what was actually happening and assess the situation. As I did so, I observed one of our Jundis, or Iraqi soldiers, in the train, with a bewildered look on his face, staring down at his weapon, an AK-47. I could see where bullets had chiseled holes in the concrete floor at his feet, just behind the SEAL operator only inches in front of him. It was suddenly clear the gunfire had not come through the door ahead of us, but from behind us, from this Jundi within our own shooter train. He had what we called an accidental discharge, or AD. Like an idiot, he'd taken his weapon off safety and placed the AK-47 selector switch on full auto. At the same time, he'd improperly had his finger on the trigger and in his nervousness squeezed off a burst of automatic gunfire. The rounds had missed one of our Charlie platoon SEALs just ahead of him in the train by only a few inches. Meanwhile, we were about to breach the door and toss a frag grenade into the next room, killing anyone on the other side within range of its deadly blast. "Put that frag grenade away. It was an AD," I shouted, loud enough so that everyone in the room could hear. "What?" a SEAL operator in the back of the train responded in disbelief. "Who?" He quickly saw me and the other SEALs next to me glaring at the offending Jundi, whose face showed a mix of terror, surprise, and guilt. As the first SEAL shooters in the train held their weapons on the locked door, the SEAL holding the frag grenade returned it safely to the grenade pouch on his gear. A SEAL breacher quickly came forward and placed a small explosive charge on the locked door. Everybody backed up a safe distance. Boom! The door opened and the first two SEALs entered, quickly followed by the rest of our SEALs and Iraqi soldiers. In the next room, just on the other side of the door, we encountered a military-age male, the head of the household and his entire family, his wife and 4 young children. He was not armed and made no effort to resist. Like most of the Muj we captured, they glorified jihad in public, but when rough men with weapons broke down their door in the night, they cowered in fear behind women and children. We detained the prisoners, and the train moved on. As our assault force cleared the rest of the building, I heard Jocko's voice on the radio net. "Leif, this is Jocko," he said. "Heard shots fired. You good?" Jocko, the ground force commander in charge of 2 separate assault forces, including ours, and the mobility element of Humvees, was outside our building with the vehicles. He had heard the gunfire and recognized it as an AK-47. Assuming we had encountered resistance from armed enemy fighters, he was waiting patiently for an update, knowing that I had my hands full and would update him when I could. "Jocko, this is Leif," I replied. "It was an AD, an Iraqi soldier." "Roger," Jocko responded simply. While other bosses might have asked for more information, such as why it had happened, and who had the AD, and if there were casualties, and if the target was secure, Jocko trusted that I had the situation under control, and if I needed help, I would ask for it. While the rest of the assault force cleared the last rooms in the building, one of my most trusted SEAL enlisted leaders, serving as the assault chief for this operation, confronted the Jundi who had accidentally discharged his weapon. This SEAL leader happened to be the one who had nearly been hit by the Iraqi soldiers' errant bullets, and he wasn't happy. The SEAL ripped the AK-47 out of the Jundi's hands, removed the magazine, and cleared the weapon. He grabbed the bewildered Iraqi soldier and unleashed a verbal tirade on him. The Jundi spoke no English, but from the SEAL's demeanor and gestures, the message was clear. He had screwed up royally and could have seriously wounded or killed some of us. He had also nearly caused us to employ a grenade that would have inflicted some horrific civilian casualties. As we still had work to do, I intervened before things could escalate further. "Let's get him outside," I said. After calling over an interpreter who translated the order into Iraqi dialect Arabic, I told the Jundi to sit and wait in the back of the vehicle. A SEAL escorted him, AK-47 rifle now empty, out to the truck to ensure he complied. Once the target was secure, I passed the word over the radio to inform Jocko and the other SEALs in the mobility element. I followed up with our prisoner handling team, which was in the process of identifying the military-age male. The prisoner soon proved to be the insurgent ringleader we were looking for. Jocko made his way through the front door and into the target building to see what we had found and if we needed any support. "We got him," I said, giving Jocko a thumbs up as he entered the room. "Here's our man." I pointed at the prisoner. The insurgent's hands were cuffed with zip ties, and he had been thoroughly searched. "That was a close one," I told Jocko. "Yeah," Jocko said. "I heard some AK fire just after you breached, and I thought, oh, you guys are going to get some," he said with a smile. "I thought we were taking fire through the door," I explained. "We were just about to toss a frag grenade into the next room. Had we done so, we likely would have killed or horribly wounded the woman and her young children. That would have been a disaster." Scary, I thought, contemplating just how easily something like that could happen in the chaos of combat. Had it occurred, it would have been a heavy burden for each of us to carry on our conscience. It would have also served as significant propaganda for our insurgent enemies, who already tried to paint us and other American troops as butchers in order to dissuade the local populace from siding with us and the government of Iraq against the insurgency. This would have had major negative repercussions on the strategic counterinsurgency mission. "Thank God you didn't let that happen," Jocko said. I literally said a quick mental prayer of thanks to God for sparing us from such a horrific outcome. Immersed in the chaos of the scene, the smoke, dust, and bullet ricochets, it was perilously easy to get sucked into the details, unable to recognize the initial conclusions as false and unmindful of the tragic consequences of getting it wrong. While in the train and focused on the threat at the next entry door, I had a hard time seeing the bigger picture and understanding what had happened. But as soon as I detached, from the moment I took just one step out of the shooter train and looked around, I immediately saw what had happened. It was a profound lesson. Leaders must be detached, must pull back to a position above the fray where they can see the bigger picture. That was the only way to effectively lead. Otherwise, the results could be disastrous. This was but the latest reminder of the same lesson I learned on one of our first combat operations in Ramadi. I've been too immersed in the details and lost track of the strategic picture. Shortly after Task Unit Bruiser's arrival in Ramadi, our intelligence shop handed me our first target package, with details on a suspected insurgent, his associations, and where he was believed to be located. This would be my first real-world operation as an assault force commander on a capture-kill direct action raid. I shared the target package with Jocko and informed him of our intention to launch on the operation that night. Jocko had extensive experience leading such missions from his previous deployment to Iraq. He let me and my key leaders run with the tactical planning. and helped us to get the wheels in motion to receive the necessary approvals through our chain of command. Getting the operation approved required an immense amount of paperwork, a Microsoft PowerPoint presentation of several detailed slides, and an extensive Microsoft Word document several pages long. Additionally, we had to coordinate with a U.S. Army unit that owned the battle space, the real estate where we planned to conduct the operation. We also needed approval through the Iraqi soldiers' chain of command, so they could accompany us. We had most of the day to plan the operation and get all the necessary approvals. But I hadn't detached. I'd gotten bogged down, obsessed with the details. I spent too much time on the approval paperwork and not enough on the plan. It was a failure to properly prioritize and execute. Having been pulled too far into the weeds, I was unable to see where the team needed to focus our efforts in the limited time we had available. As the time for launch neared, our mission brief was not yet complete, and I wasn't confident that we were ready. Besides, we hadn't yet received approval for launch. With the pressure mounting, I vented my frustrations to Jocko. "I don't believe we will be ready in time to launch," I told him. "I think we should delay the operation and wait until tomorrow night." Jocko disagreed. "Leif," he said in a reassuring tone, "this isn't that hard. You and the platoon are more than ready. You will see. We will get the approvals. Go ahead and brief the mission, and we'll launch as soon as it's approved." While I became fixated on the immediate tasks to plan and execute this mission, Jocko was detached. He saw the bigger picture and why it was critical for us, for Task Unit Bruiser, to launch on as many operations as possible in those first few days on the ground. "We need to generate momentum," Jocko said. "We need to do as many operations as we can here at the beginning of deployment so that we develop the experience and build the task group's confidence in us. If we can generate enough momentum early on, that will set the tone and carry us throughout our time here." Overwhelmed by the myriad details of the approval and planning process, I'd lost sight of the strategic vision. I now realized that in the bigger picture, it was important that we launch this operation that night and not delay. Once I gained that perspective, I was determined to make it happen. We finalized our brief, quickly filled in the remaining holes in the plan, and delivered the mission brief, the operations order or op order, to the team. Shortly after the op order concluded, we received approval and launched on the operation. As Jocko predicted, it wasn't that hard. I hadn't needed to overthink it. We captured the insurgent, gathered some intelligence, and returned to base without incident. When we got back, I walked into Jocko's office. "You were right," I said. "It wasn't that hard." Going forward, I recognized that I needed to better prioritize and execute. To do that, I needed to detach, to not get so focused on the details, but instead be mindful of the broader aspect of the planning and approval process. My platoon would handle the details, and I trusted them to do so. Otherwise, time would slip away, and the critically important things could get overlooked. I understood why it was critical to keep my eye on the strategic picture and pass that perspective on to my platoon. But I could do that only if I didn't get dragged into the tactical details. There was a dichotomy here, and finding the equilibrium was difficult. I learned to detach myself from the details so I could more effectively lead. But a few weeks later, I learned the hard way that if a leader becomes too detached, too far removed from the details, critical steps were missed and the team's performance suffered. I've been slammed by this reality upon our return from one combat operation in Ramadi. We've been back at our camp, Shark Base, for several hours when our leading petty officer approached me with bad news. Charlie Platoon's lead SEAL communicator, our radioman, had informed him that we were missing a very sensitive piece of communications equipment. I was taken aback. How can that be? I asked, stunned. There were strict procedures in place to ensure we had proper control of such highly classified and essential gear at all times. These procedures applied to all branches of the U.S. military. I went to speak to my lead SEAL communicator. What happened? I asked him. He told me how he discovered the gear was missing. It was clear that he and our other SEAL radiomen had not followed proper procedures. This was a serious incident and a major embarrassment for Charlie Platoon. Worse, it cast a negative light on Task Unit Bruiser and our entire SEAL team. I had to go tell Jocko what had happened. He wasn't happy. As a former SEAL radioman himself, he understood the strict procedures that must be followed and the clear lack of discipline Charlie Platoon had shown in violating them. I was furious with my SEAL communicators. They knew better. But more important, I was furious with myself. I was to blame. Casting blame on my radioman was the opposite of extreme ownership. This was my fault, and I knew it. I had become too detached. I'd given my radiomen far too much leeway. I hadn't periodically checked on them and ensured that proper procedures were being followed. I'd stepped too far back from the details of Charlie Platoon's communications department. Initially, as Charlie Platoon began our training cycle the year before, I'd kept a much closer eye on our communications equipment procedures. But after a single early misstep, which we quickly rectified, my lead SEAL communicator routinely demonstrated he was on top of things. I felt confident in his ability to run his department, and I let him run it. I focused my attention elsewhere, and frankly, once we were on the ground in Ramadi, I had been pulled in too many different directions. I had gotten so busy that I hadn't made time to check in with my lead communicator to ensure that he and the other SEAL radiomen were in compliance with proper radio equipment handling procedures. In About Face, Colonel David Hackworth wrote that he had learned this fundamental truth from his U.S. Army mentors. An organization does well only those things the boss checks. Regularly checking up on procedures showed the team what I found important. Had I done so with our radio equipment, my SEAL communicators would have never gotten lax, and they would have ensured proper procedures were followed. I hadn't reminded them how critical it was for us to do so, and what was at stake if we didn't. Now, Task Unit Bruiser had to own this failure, my failure. There were also strict procedures to follow in the event such gear was lost, and I ensured we followed them to a T. We immediately passed the word up the chain and told our higher headquarters what had happened. We sent out a military-wide electronic message informing everyone that we had lost the critical communications equipment. It was a big black eye for us, for Task Unit Bruiser, for Charlie Platoon, and for me in particular. But I had to own it. Most important, I had to make sure we would never let it happen again. We canceled Charlie Platoon's combat operation for that evening. It would have been a good one. A mission we'd been planning for a couple of weeks, and I was disappointed not to be able to execute it. We almost certainly would have gotten into some big mix-it-ups, killed a number of enemy fighters, and likely had substantial strategic impact in a volatile area of the city. Instead, we loaded up in our Humvees and returned to the U.S. combat outposts where we'd last utilized the missing equipment. A thorough search found nothing within the confines of the outpost's perimeter defenses of concrete barriers and concertina wire. We then launched a foot patrol along the route we had taken previously, a road that suffered frequent, vicious attacks from insurgents. It made for difficult searching, but we had enough SEALs covering with their weapons so others could scan the pavement and trash piles. After an extensive search of several hundred yards, we turned around to head back to the combat outpost. As we patrolled back, suddenly, two insurgents opened up on us with AK-47s from an alleyway that ran perpendicular to the main road along which we patrolled. Several SEALs immediately returned fire, sending the insurgents running. Mark Lee, Chris Kyle, and I gave chase down the alleyway, using cover and move. But by the time we reached their previous location, the insurgents were long gone. They disappeared into the walled residential compounds of the congested urban neighborhood. It was time to wrap up and head home. We never found the missing equipment. As for me, I had learned a valuable lesson about this dichotomy. In order to effectively lead, I had to detach. But I must never become too detached. I couldn't obsess over the details, but I should nevertheless be attentive to them. It was a humbling lesson learned that I would never forget. Principle. Naturally, leaders must be attentive to details. However, leaders cannot be so immersed in the details that they lose track of the larger strategic situation and are unable to provide command and control for the entire team. In combat, when you look down the sights of your weapon, your field of view becomes narrow and focused. Your vision is restricted by the small aperture of your weapon sight. You cannot see what is happening around you or the team. It is critical, then, to ensure that a leader's default position should be at high port, gun pointed at the sky, standing back to observe with the widest field of vision possible. This enables a leader to look around and even move around where he or she can best provide command and control for the team. Most important, it allows a leader to keep the larger, overarching goals of the mission in perspective. The analogy applies directly to non-combat situations. It is no different in the business world, where leaders must ensure they don't get sucked into the tactical details, but maintain the ability to detach. In Extreme Ownership, Chapter 7, Prioritize and Execute, we wrote, "When confronted with the enormity of operational plans and the intricate microterrain within those plans, it becomes easy to get lost in the details. It is crucial for leaders to pull themselves off the firing line, step back, and maintain the strategic picture." This key concept resonated with many readers and helped them improve their leadership skills. Detachment is also an ongoing issue with which many leaders struggle. Leaders cannot allow themselves to get so obsessed by the details that they lose focus on the bigger picture. It is essential for leaders to understand that this should be their default mindset, so they can always be aware of it. If they don't maintain a position above the fray, then leaders are failing their team and failing the mission. What we didn't clearly articulate in Extreme Ownership is the need to balance somewhere between understanding the details and becoming completely submerged and overwhelmed by them. Leaders can't get so far away, so detached that they lose track of what's happening on the front lines. Leaders must still be attentive to the details, understand the challenges of the teams executing the mission at the front echelon, and position themselves where they can best support their teams. This is the dichotomy that must be balanced. To become engrossed in and overwhelmed by the details risks mission failure. But to be so far detached from the details that the leader loses control is to fail the team and fail the mission. Application to business. For some reason, I wasn't thinking about this in my office yesterday, said Rob. But sitting here in the classroom today, it's all of a sudden very clear where we as a company should be focused to improve our process and increase profitability. Modularization, Rob continued. We need to be thinking modularization in everything that we do. This will help us reduce extensive man-hours on site that generate huge costs. It will increase our efficiency and help project managers cut down operating expenses. That sounds promising, I remarked. It's a great observation and one I'd like to dive into in more detail with everyone here. But before we do that, let's pull back for a second and analyze why this is all of a sudden clear to you. Why do you think you weren't thinking about this yesterday? Why is it so easy to see now? I asked Rob. For the leaders in the room, understanding the answer to this question was paramount. The recognition and understanding of the dichotomy of leadership, the opposing forces that must be balanced, served as a powerful leadership tool to help each of them lead and win. I stood in front of a classroom of 15 senior leaders of a highly successful company. Echelon Front had been hired to run a leadership development and alignment program for their senior leaders. Most of the participants were division managers with a wealth of experience and knowledge in their industry. The company had generated a record of success and built a solid reputation that enabled them to make substantial gains on competitors and increase their market share. As the company grew, the senior executive team wisely noted that they had no formal leadership training program for their senior leaders, and one was warranted. They asked Echelon Front to develop a program to help build into the culture of their team the principles of extreme ownership they'd read about. After an initial assessment with one-on-one interviews of participants and discussion with each participant's boss, we launched the kickoff with an intensive full-day training session. We then scheduled follow-on training events at rotating locations throughout the company's operating region every few weeks. Here, at the third training session, a number of the leaders had traveled from their territories and the home offices where they spent much of their time. Independent of the content I presented and the questions and discussions generated, the requirement for each participant to pull away from his or her daily grind brought significant benefits. It forced them to detach. Removed from the details, pressures, and pressing deadlines of the front lines, they found it easier to see the strategic priorities with clarity and how best to achieve them. This concept of detachment was a critical leadership skill on and off the battlefield, in business and in life. I repeated the question to Rob and for everyone else in the group. Why do you think you weren't thinking about this yesterday? Why is it all of a sudden clear now? Yesterday, I was making phone calls, dealing with immediate fires on a couple of different projects, and pretty much buried in my email inbox, Rob answered. You are immersed in the details, down in the weeds, I said, in agreement, and you have to be attentive to those details. You can't pull back too much, but you can't obsess about the details. Your job as a leader is to detach, stand back, and see the bigger picture. Attending this training session has pulled you away from those details, I continued. And as you sit here in the classroom, you're detached. Now, what needs to be done is much clearer. It's a key lesson that you must learn. I relayed how I had learned this lesson in the SEAL teams. On the battlefield, as a leader, when you look down the sights of your weapon, I explained, your field of vision is reduced from 180 degrees or more around you to only what you can see through the small aperture of your scope or aiming device. The narrow view isn't the leader's job. The leader's job is to look around and see the bigger picture. I recognized that in a SEAL platoon, which carried a massive amount of firepower, my rifle didn't count for much. But if I wasn't looking around, who was? No one. It was up to me. Leadership in the business world is no different, I explained. All of you, as senior leaders, should be striving to detach so you can stand back, gain perspective, and recognize where your priorities should be focused. But this is something you have to balance, I continued. You have to detach, but you can't be so detached that you don't know what is going on. Because if you don't know what is going on, you can't help your team. You can't lead. To illustrate this dichotomy for the class, I told them how, as a SEAL platoon commander, I found myself struggling with where to position myself in the kill house during our close quarters combat training, where the team practiced clearing rooms and hallways in an urban environment. In my previous platoon, I've been told that as an officer, my role was to stand in the back of the train. "Why are you in the back of the train?" Jocko asked me, observing Charlie Platoon's runs through the kill house from the catwalk above. "I thought that was where I was supposed to be," I answered. "Can you tell what's going on with your guys at the front of the train?" Jocko asked. "I have no idea what's going on up front," I admitted. If I didn't know what was going on up front, how could I lead? I certainly couldn't help the team solve a particularly challenging problem, vector more resources to my shooters, or provide proper command and control. If you don't know what's going on, you can't lead, Jocko told me. You can't be in the back because you don't know what's happening up front. You can't be all the way up front because then you get sucked into every room clearance, and then you're too far into the tactical details to provide proper command and control. Your position should be somewhere in the middle, with a bulk of your forces, close enough to the front to know what is going on, but far enough back that you aren't in the weeds doing the tactical work. It made sense. It was simple, but Jocko's guidance was illuminating. I gained confidence and fully understood where I should be as a leader. Most important, I realized I wasn't stuck in a particular position. I could move around and see what was happening and assist the team members where they needed it the most. It was an important lesson that I never forgot. To find that careful balance, I told the company's senior leaders, make sure you don't go to the extreme in either direction. I've seen SEAL leaders and a number of business leaders who have gone too far. You must maintain the balance, detached, but not so detached that you don't know what's going on and can't lead. Any leader, when things are going very badly for the team, has to step in and help them solve problems. I have seen some leaders who felt they were above solving problems. This is an extreme form of detachment, one we call battlefield aloofness. It's not a good thing. It can result in epic failure. I told the class how Jocko had used the term to describe an overly detached SEAL leader while we were observing a SEAL task unit during a training operation. The SEAL was a task unit commander, serving as the ground force commander during a field training exercise in a MOUT, military operations in urban terrain facility. His platoons were heavily engaged in a difficult tactical problem inside one of the large cinder block buildings, with multiple role players attacking them with paintball rounds. The task unit had pulled its vehicles to a stop outside of the target building, and their assault force had dismounted and entered the building. Immediately, they were heavily engaged by a number of well-entrenched enemy fighters, actually SEAL instructors and role players. Quickly, several SEALs were hit, and the training instructors put them down, meaning they were simulated killed or severely wounded. The rest of the SEAL assault force was pinned down inside the target building. They needed help, resources, guidance, and direction. Jocko and I, inside the house observing the SEAL platoon in action, waited for someone to step up and assist, but it never came. "Where's the task unit commander?" Jocko asked, after several painful minutes of watching the problem escalate. I looked around, but didn't see him. "I think he is still outside in his Humvee," I observed. Jocko and I walked outside of the target building. The task unit commander was nowhere to be seen. Finally, We approached the line of Humvees parked on the street outside the target building. We found the task unit commander inside, sitting comfortably in his seat. We opened the heavy armored door of his Humvee. "What's crappin'?" I said, borrowing a favorite phrase from our brother and former task unit bruiser Delta Platoon Commander Seth Stone. The task unit commander said nothing. "What's going on in there?" Jocko asked the task unit commander, motioning toward the target building where his team was pinned down. The task unit commander didn't answer. He looked down at his map, but never moved from his seat in the back of the Humvee. "I'm waiting for a status update," he responded, as if he were perfectly on top of things. He keyed up his radio. "What's your status?" he asked, directed at his platoon commander, the assault force commander in the house. Jocko and I both wore radios and monitored the task unit's communications network so we could listen in on their radio traffic and evaluate the leadership's communications between one another. There was no answer over the radio. The platoon commander and much of his team were pinned down in a horrific gun battle inside the house. They had several simulated casualties and were trying to pull them out of a hot hallway, meaning bullets were flying down the hallway. The platoon commander was not in a position to even hear the radio transmission, much less respond to it. "I need a status update," the task unit commander repeated on the radio net. No status update was sent. Another half minute of silence passed. "So what's going on?" Jocko asked. "I don't know," the task unit commander replied. "I'm waiting for a status update." Jocko turned and looked at me, puzzled. "Maybe you should move toward your assault force commander and go get a status update," I said. "You aren't stuck in the vehicle. Move around to wherever you can best provide command and control. Or you could sit here in your Humvee and wait for everyone to die." With that, the task unit commander got out of the vehicle and moved toward the target building to try to figure out what was happening. "Battlefield aloofness," Jocko said. "That's the best term I can think of for that level of detachment." It meant that the leader was so detached he had no idea what was going on. If there were problems, he expected someone else to solve them. This task unit commander actually seemed annoyed that he had to step out of the Humvee and lead. But he quickly learned that when the team is on the verge of disaster, it's time for the senior leader to put detachment aside and step into the fray to solve problems and help the team. It's time to lead. Once those problems are getting solved, the leader can then step back to a position of detachment. With this, I illustrated for the classroom of leaders how it was essential to balance the dichotomy, to remain focused, but also detached. Now, the class understood how they could best apply this concept, find the equilibrium, and lead their teams to victory.